All right. Thank you very much for coming in this morning. I realize with the weather, that's kind of delayed things a little bit, and hopefully a few more folks will come in here. But again, thank you, Brett, for the opportunity to moderate this panel. We're here with a couple of distinguished gentlemen from the industry, Moses Choi from Orange and Jacob, is it Whitish? Whitish. That's an interesting name in this area, in the era of diversity. And he's with the UK Trade Council. Moses with Orange SV. I'm going to just go ahead and kind of kick things off and let both of these guys introduce themselves, tell a little bit about what their charter is, and kind of as it relates to the topic. Moses, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, I mean, maybe we can be a little bit more kind of personal here too, just given the size of the audience, and would love to make this as much of a discussion as possible. So my name is Moses. I joined Orange Silicon Valley about 5 months ago. Spent about 10 years on the street at Citigroup for 7 years and Morgan Stanley for about 10 years between both firms. Our interest in financial services as a global telco goes back about 10 years ago, where we launched a mobile money business primarily in our West Africa region. And through sort of our thinking of being a global telco, we launched about a 5-year strategy a number of years ago. And one of the key pillars of that was how to diversify revenue sources with our existing assets. And to make a much longer story short, and I'll delve more into it, we launched a bank in France about 2 weeks ago called Orange Bank. And so we're the first global telco to go fully into banking. And with that, our office here is mandated to essentially be the firm's innovation hub. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, we do 3 things. One is we work on product innovation with internal partners. We do research on emerging tech. And lastly, we write checks to Series A and Series B companies to help accelerate some strategic innovation for the company. I think the big picture for us, though, is when you think about kind of the evolution of global telcos, margins are thin, and we operate in a highly commoditized industry. And so when we think about sort of going into financial services, we have the touch points with the consumers. We know what their patterns are as it relates to sort of their wireless usage. So the question for us is, what more can we do for our customers? How do we provide more long-term value? And banking is a strategic bet that the company has made to push that agenda.
Interesting. Jacob?
Sure. So I might not be quite as interesting as Moses. I don't know.
You are.
So as we already kind of mentioned, I work for the Department for International Trade out of the British Consulate here in San Francisco. I specialize in working with FinTech, finance, professional business service companies, kind of all over. I represent the whole western US north of San Francisco, basically. And my job is essentially to help spur economic activity within the UK, and we do that really through helping companies either expand to the UK, helping UK companies expand back to the US, or helping them find business opportunities with one another. A lot of that takes place through just networking and helping to make connections. Knowing the people to connect businesses to, knowing which regulators to introduce people to. A lot of times just having that relationship is going to make all the difference in the success of somebody's international expansion. So I'm sure we'll probably get into the Brexit side of things as well, which of course comes up in every discussion that we have, but I think I'll leave it there for right now.
Okay, great, thank you. Again, to what Moses said, since we're a relatively small audience, I just want to take a quick pulse. How many of you are investors? Raise your hand. Okay, 1. How many are startups or entrepreneurs? Okay, so more heavy on that side, and then other, I think Deloitte, maybe service providers hoping to sell to either of the above. Okay, great, thank you. So just a little bit of pulse on the audience. Let's talk a little bit about Orange for a second, because I don't know, in my mind that represents a pretty big departure from maybe what your charter has traditionally been, which is to help foster the entrepreneurial community as it relates to, telecommunications and things like that. So does that mean that you're a FinTech hub now and you want to entertain FinTech startups perhaps to help develop the banking platform that you guys have just announced?
Absolutely. So, if you're a startup and or an investor, we're keen to build the ecosystem out here through our office in Silicon Valley. But we're absolutely committed to identifying new innovations, startups that are accretive to our strategic vision as a company, and finding ways to either partner, license, and or potentially acquire. So our mandate here is not only to grow the ecosystem and to source new opportunities, but as I mentioned, finding ways to do product innovation. So just about a week and a half ago, actually our office was working quite closely with a different part of our organization called Orange Business Services. And we launched a partnership with a Swiss digital finance platform called Additive. And so, our office engages in those types of opportunities as well. And Additive has been around for over a decade, but they just raised a 21 million Swiss franc round in May. So to your point, Peter, we're absolutely committed to identifying new opportunities.
Okay, did you guys invest in that one?
We did not.
Okay. Then in terms of, what kind of charter are you personally given here locally to either advance the charter, or do they dictate what they would like to see? So for example, two of the biggest areas of investment are obviously AI and blockchain, and then there's kind of everything else, which is typically not very much highlighted. So what can you tell us about where that direction is coming in terms of where you guys are looking?
No, great question. And I would anticipate for any of those who engage with kind of corporate innovation units, it is very much a push and pull. So I was in Paris and Zurich over the past couple of weeks, primarily to understand what the pull is and to build relationships with internal partners. As I mentioned, I've been here for less than half a year. But through that, we've been able to identify what some of the roadmaps are for some of the businesses that we work with. So we can identify what their priorities are and then basically go source potential partnerships or investment opportunities. With that said, we've also been a push kind of engine as well. And so we think a lot about what's happening over the next kind of wave of innovation. And actually we made a strategic investment in Chain a couple of years ago because we wanted to really kind of test and understand how blockchain works. And that's definitely something that there was no business unit asking for us to source a blockchain deal. It was much more we were pushing that agenda. So it kind of is a combination of both push and pull. Okay.
Would you say that's kind of a learning vehicle for Orange, or do you have something specific in mind as it relates to blockchain? There's a lot of hype floating around about how blockchain is going to impact the industry, but I don't see a lot on very, very specific use cases about how it's being developed.
Hype is an understatement.
Okay.
But with that said, certainly there's a learning aspect to it. What I can say confidentially is that we are working on certain initiatives within our company that are leveraging blockchain-based technology. And we anticipate that in 2018, you'll see some press release about some of the things that we're doing in that arena. And sorry, I just.
No, that's okay. That's what we want to hear. The idea is to, get some additional insight,
Sure.
as opposed to just, regurgitating the hype that's out there. So that's very helpful. Yeah. So appreciate that. So Jacob, tell us a little bit about your charter as it relates to UK trade. How does it, again, Moses mentioned it's a push-pull kind of thing. To what extent do you have leeway in funneling either startups or companies or, additional insight into how you develop your program?
Yeah, there actually is a fair bit of leeway. We're measured both on terms of the discrete number of companies that expand into the UK, but we also are measured just on general economic activity that we're helping to promote, generally measured in terms of a value of investment. So whether that be capital, the number of people, business deals that we're able to help connect, and then the value of those deals. So we are measured. We're funded by taxpayers, so we have to make sure that we can actually report that we're a good use of that money. In terms of kind of that push-pull, it's a lot more free. We're able to work on the opportunities that we are able to find. Like I said, we are measured on both sides, so we do have to actually come through on both. But if we find more opportunities on one side than the other, we are able to still pursue that and take advantage of whatever opportunities there are. Hopefully those opportunities keep coming.
Okay, and so how do you find them, or how do they find you? Is there an application form on your website? Should the startups come and talk to you if they want to, find out what's kind of going on in the London fintech scene? If they wanted to, tap into that, what's the best way?
Yeah, it's just absolutely a mix of all different things. We get referrals from other companies that have worked with us. We get people who just come up to us at events like this. We do a lot of outward reaching out to people also. We keep a pretty good tabs of who's doing what within the fintech and finance spaces, and most likely if a company hasn't already heard from us, they will sometime in the near future.
And what vehicles do you have? Do you have a fund? Is it? How do you help provide market entry to London and the greater European market?
So we don't have any internal fund, but we do have connections to people who do. A lot of it, kind of like I mentioned up front, is through knowing who to connect to what opportunities. We have very good relations with a lot of different VCs and funds here in the Valley and know what kinds of companies that they're looking for. So in some cases, if a company comes to us and says, hey, we want to expand to the Valley from London, for instance, and as part of this, we're also looking for Series A investment, I would be able to get essentially what their value proposition is, what they're looking for, all of the vital details, and then determine which funds might be a good opportunity for that. A lot of times it's in the company's best interest to talk to us about that kind of thing, because we can in fact kind of backdoor some of those introductions and get them in the door where they might not have been able to otherwise.
Okay, and then obviously we can't let you go without saying something about Brexit. Okay, so when it originally happened, there was a lot of hype around doom and gloom, and it's basically the end of the world for the London fintech scene. What's the what's the real dirt on Brexit, and how should startups kind of approach that?
I would say that I won't go so far as to say it's a non-issue, but it's nowhere near what the media would have you think. There's a lot of uncertainty, and really that's the biggest issue around it. Is just that people don't quite know exactly what is going to happen, and so they're slowing down a little bit. The interest is still there. It's still the number 5 economy. It's still the number 2 in terms of deal volume for venture investment in the world. You're not going to be able to recreate the London finance ecosystem anywhere else, especially not in the very, very near future. So at the end of the day, the trade is still good for everybody. Passporting is still good for everybody. In fact, actually just this week, we announced that we've doubled the number of Tier 1 visas available for tech workers. So despite what the media would have you think, we are in fact actually trying to encourage that. It's going to be a bit of an adjustment period, but at the end of the day, when all is said and done, it's still going to be the place to go for fintech. Maybe you have another view on it from kind of your side of things.
Go ahead, Moses. Go for it.
It's a tough question for me. I mean,
throw the
curveball. It's interesting. I mean, our company made an equity investment in a company called Monzo, which is one of these in Europe they call neobanks, which has gained a lot of traction over the past year or so. I would say, from where I sit and kind of how I've been viewing the world over the past few months, is most of these, and this is a very generic answer, so I won't go specific into Brexit, because that's a little bit less sort of salient for the geography where we're dispersed as a firm. But what I'll say is these markets are hyper local, and so Orange, which operates in a couple dozen countries in Europe, but also in Africa, is much of the innovation and the work that we do is led by country managers, and all that to say is I think when I think of Brexit in general, like having been on Wall Street for 10 years, I mean, I think you're absolutely right is, traders, investors, the markets want stability, and they want to know what the actual rules are of the game are, and then how can I actually make moves based on the clarity around what's happening. So all that to say is I think, the markets are hyper-local, and I think that also having clarity is super important. So.
Yeah, just an interesting point about the doubling of visas. So that's, I guess, an unintended consequence and one that was not exactly forecasted, but that's kind of a policy initiative. Perhaps you should have a chat with the Trump administration, who seems to be no friend of the startup community these days. But at any rate, I agree with you. I look at it as more of a non-issue personally. The way I look at change, massive change like that, is there's always opportunity, and it's just what you make of it. If it makes sense for your company, or your startup, or whatever, to go into Europe or London, Brexit shouldn't really enter into it as a top initiative to be concerned with.
Can I ask a quick question for the startups in the room? I mean, how many of you are expanding or generating business outside of the U.S.? Show of hands. One. Okay. Helpful.
Okay. It is.
It usually takes a little while. I would say a lot of the companies that we see are somewhere between the Series A and B level. So it takes a while to really make it a worthwhile business case before most companies are looking at that. Okay.
Just kind of switching gears a little bit, I went to the startup thing last night, and I kind of made a joke to one of the startups. I said, if you're not in blockchain or AI, I don't want to talk to you, because that seems to be kind of the overwhelming hype, if you will, around what types of startups are being incubated in industry. How much of your attention is being paid to solely AI and blockchain versus other areas in terms of what you're looking at, or where you think things are going?
I would say from our side, it's definitely, you can see that the trend is there. Not necessarily is it that we're focusing on it from our end, but we are seeing a lot more of those kinds of companies coming out, especially around regulatory and compliance issues.
I mean, we're spending a significant amount of time looking at blockchain and AI. I think to your kind of point earlier, I think certainly there is a lot of hype. I mean, if you think about just kind of the volumes of capital raised in the ICO market as just kind of a signaling of interest in blockchain-based projects in those respective companies, I think there's certainly lots of demand. We are, in the long run, we're bullish on blockchain in the use case and the resourcefulness of distributed ledgers. But certainly, I think, to your point earlier, Peter, I think there is still a lot of hype in the market, and it's trying to find specific use cases that you see some level of scale. In terms of AI, I mean, focused on like financial services, it's certainly a buzzword in the market, to say the least. But from a much more practical perspective, things that we're focused on in our office include alternative credit and thinking about different ways to underwrite credit for consumers, both in our Europe and in our Africa business. So if there are any companies out here that are looking at alternative credit scoring using different types of data sets, not traditional data, that's something that we're quite interested in.
So meaning completely new developments, like in a firm or something like that. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, Affirm, they're kind of focused more on point of sale financing, but we've seen in the emerging market context, companies like EFL, Entrepreneurial Finance Lab, which was started within the Harvard Center for International Development. We've seen companies like Demis Data, Lendo, and others look at different ways to underwrite credit scores to essentially consumers who don't have transactional data histories.
The unbanked, as it were.
Yes.
Okay, a little plug for for Brett. Jacob?
If I may, actually, I would have a question kind of dovetailing off of that. As a bank and telco, do you have any concern, or are you really, I guess, more excited about AI coming in and replacing a part of your workforce?
I think AI, there will be, some changes in how the workforce engages with AI, but, we haven't seen, at least from where we sit, and in particular, my focus on financial services within Orange, like we haven't seen massive shifts in terms of innovation that's going to massively replace people in the very short term. I think in the intermediate term, there's no doubt that there will be a lot of efficiency gain from AI and just through the computing power and the GPUs, and the cost of computer processing has come down significantly. So we do anticipate that there will be more resourcefulness for companies, but as a firm, I mean, I haven't seen anything internally that suggests that our workforce is should be worried about, AI replacing massive parts of our business.
Yeah, let's stick on that topic for a second, because again, the Deutsche Bank CEO came out and said, a few weeks ago that, a certain portion of his workforce is going to be completely out of a job because of AI, in 5 years' time. I mean, okay, that's all fine and good. What about 5 months' time? I mean, what's real today in AI? Where are we starting to see benefits, if at all? Again, versus either looking at experimental stuff or placing some bets on startups who are doing some really cool things in AI.
So
what's real?
I've seen a lot from the kind of value chain of being able to move the humans further up the value chain. So you can use something like a AI bot to handle a lot of very simple customer service, either actions or queries. Saw a couple of really cool demos very recently, actually, of exactly that at the other FinTech Week events that have been going on. But having things like that allows you to free up the time from your customer service people from answering the, what's my bank account balance? Can I please transfer $10 from this account to that account? And instead work on things more like, I didn't make this transaction, can you help me out with that? Or have a lot more of the sort of interactions with humans that require more of an actual human touch.
Yeah, I think the bot area is one that we've been looking at internally. I would say kind of there's some, I would argue some hype around the power of chatbots. I think they are very useful as it relates to extracting very specific types of questions or account level data. But in terms of training the actual data set and using algorithms so that there's more predictive capability, we haven't seen necessarily a lot of that level of resourcefulness for chatbots. We've seen things like, I'm sure this audience is probably familiar with, like, JP Morgan in there, I think it was their syndicated loans business, announced some kind of, bot to train a bot to review legal paperwork. So it was like loan documentation, and they got rid of, I think, 360,000 hours of lawyer hours, which is significant from a fee perspective. So we've seen that, and we've seen things in the fraud area where there's some learning around kind of biometrics and behavioral patterns in terms of once you're authenticated within a session, how does a computer understand the patterns of specific individuals and how they can predict whether or not that's the right person within an authenticated session. So we've seen some level of predictiveness, but there hasn't been sort of, I think, within the chatbot space, like I think there's still some hype around their capabilities. That's not to say I don't think, I think we're exploring things in that realm. So if folks here are looking at chatbots, we're keen to learn as well.
Excellent. I want to go ahead and maybe open it up to the audience a little bit. Any questions out there that come to mind? Otherwise, I've got a few more myself, or depending on how we are on time. That's up to Brett. He's giving me the peace sign. Oh, that's 2 minutes. Okay, thank you. Yes. I'll go ahead and just paraphrase the question, because I think we want to keep that for the video. It's just the question from Moses about how to take back the innovation coming from the various innovation centers back to corporate, where we're tasked, we're dealing with bureaucracy and in terms of getting things done and seeing innovation really filter through the organization.
Corporate innovation is hard. It's hard work. There's no doubt. I mean, we have 150,000 people at this firm. We throw off about $50 billion on the top line. We're a very capital expenditure intensive business. And so, it's not easy. I will say a couple of things. One is probably 15 years ago, this office was much more of a lab, so it's kind of an R&D focused unit. We've evolved that model into much more open innovation, so working with startups and collaborating with the ecosystem here in the Bay. We are constantly, through our CEO here named George, he is constantly working with senior management at the company, at the sort of the COMEX level or the OpCo level of the firm to communicate the innovations that we see in the market. So there's a lot of internal education. I will say from where I sit, working on financial services innovation specifically, within the 5 months that I've been here, we've been able to garner a lot of traction. Again, we announced a new solution a week ago in the digital finance realm. We're working on a couple of other projects in the alternative credit scoring sort of arena. And we've got a number of projects working with business units that have pretty significant traction. So, am I moving 40, 50,000 people at any given time to help them think about kind of innovation? Some of that comes tops down, but really I'm much more focused on delivering on specific product innovations and working with startups to identify how to do that.
Hopefully that answers the question. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Brett. Please give our panelists a nice round of applause, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much.